actually got married in the cloud in Haweswater. I don't quite, maybe you'll explain how you managed to get in the cloud, but that's a quote from your book.
It's a polite way of saying it was raining.
It was raining, okay. He spent the last 9 years trying to, in his words, breathe back life into 30 square kilometres of upland habitat, lamenting the loss of the black grouse and the golden eagle and corncrakes, and many other birds who used to live here. His knowledge of flowers and bogs seemed to be encyclopedic and made me personally feel very inadequate in terms of my own knowledge of local plant ecology, and I'm sure we'll learn much more about the secrets of the pyramidal bugle and others during his talk. On his journey, he's had many ups and downs, all exquisitely and honestly described in his book. I think we're in for a treat. I had the pleasure of listening to him when he gave a talk at Words by the Water Festival in Keswick, when he really wowed the audience, and I'm sure you will be tonight. After the talk, he's willing to sign copies for those who haven't had the occasion to purchase the book. And we of course have online questions questions online and also from the audience. So without any further ado, can I pass the floor to Lee, and we look forward to what you have to say.
Thank you. That's a very generous introduction. Thank you very much. Thanks all for coming. Tim's done a nice introduction for me, so I don't really need to do too much of that really. So yeah, first and foremost, I'm the site manager at Haweswater. The whole author thing is all a bit of a surprise to me really, and I'm still getting used to introducing myself in that way. So working at Haweswater, it seems good to start with a view, this view. So this is a pretty good vantage point to look over much of the land that we're looking after at Haweswater. So all the land on the far side of the reservoir there, that's over to Naddle Farm and Naddle Forest. And this is standing looking over Riggindale. So that's the Riggindale Beck winding down below the ridge there. And standing in a place like this makes me feel a whole range of different things. I think, anybody standing and looking at a view of the Lake District feels lots of different things. Most people feel a sense of real awe at the grandeur of the landscape. I feel a real sense of responsibility if I'm standing here looking at somewhere like that. Like anybody who's managing land, the feeling of knowing that the decisions that my colleagues and I make and the things that we do are going to have an impact on this landscape. They're going to affect how wildlife fares in this place and how different species might increase or decrease. I also feel a real sense of sadness looking at a landscape like this, because over the course of the last decade that I've been working at Haweswater, I've learned more and more about some of the things that I can't see in this landscape, some of the things that are missing. And effectively this, if you're looking back through time and how things have changed, this is really a landscape that's full of holes. So if I stood in the same place 10 years ago, there was a reasonable chance that I might have caught sight of one of these. England's last golden eagle was present in the Valley of Riggindale up until 2015. He returned, a pair returned in 1969, and that's what attracted the RSPB to the area first of all. After 170 years of absence, where there were no golden eagles anywhere in England, they came back as a result of the population in southern Scotland expanding. And they settled first of all on Harterfell, the big crag that you see if you pull up in the car park at the end of Haweswater. And then a year later, they moved round into Riggindale, and that was where they stayed for the next 45 years. So there was a succession of 5 birds altogether. So as one half of the pair died, another one arrived to make the pair back up again, up until about 2003, when the second female died and the last male was left all by himself. And he displayed every year in the hope of attracting a female into his territory. But by that point, the population in Scotland had dwindled and there weren't enough birds in the vicinity. And so in 2015, around about the same time as Storm Desmond was knocking hell out of the countryside, he disappeared. And we suspect that he probably just died of old age. He was 20 years old, and probably the rough weather had made it really hard for him to hunt, and he probably simply starved to death. But we'll never know for sure. And so England became eagleless again. And I think the fact that the whole of the English countryside is incapable of supporting even an individual single one of their kind, I think is pretty shameful, really. And eagles, of course, aren't the only missing thing. The Lake District really could be described as a landscape of ghosts, and you only have to look around to see features such as this. This is a building called High Loop, and having done a bit of research into it and spoken to a few different people, loop, it seems, comes from lupine, as in wolves. And so the original origin of the little cluster of buildings that sits on this shoulder up above Haweswater is probably, these were probably shepherd's huts. These were places that people would be up on the hills protecting their livestock against the risk of predation by wolves. So this one is obviously a slightly more modern incarnation, but when you look around in the bracken that surrounds this area, you find remains of much, much older buildings. So probably the stones have been recycled into new structures over a period of time. And really, it's the wolves in the landscape that did a huge amount to influence the farming culture in this part of the world. It is that practice of, transhumance, of moving around livestock and staying with them, that is the origin of the kind of the hefting system that we have now. If it wasn't for that predation risk, if it wasn't for the vulnerability of those livestock, then those practices never really would have evolved. And I'm not, before any of you get concerned, advocating that we need wolves back again, but they have played a really, really important role in kind of how we interact with this landscape and how we farm, which I think is pretty interesting. So when you look around the maps of the Lake District, you see lots of wolf places. You see there's wolf crags, places that have got Ulf in the title, comes from the Old Norse word for wolf. Haweswater potentially has a wolf name origin. So clearly there were lots of wolves around not that long ago, during the time of the Vikings. And as you look around other maps, you start to pick out other wild animal place names. So there's lots of eagle crags, there's lots of heron crags, and actually heron crag relates to ern, the white-tailed eagle. Herons don't nest on crags, so that is a corruption of ern, the white-tailed eagle. So when you see a heron crag or an iron crag, and there's an ern crag in Grasmere as well, I think, those are white-tailed eagle places. There's also mart crags, pine martins. There's places that relate to wildcats, black grouse, red kites. There's even a couple of crane places, I think. So, all of these species have disappeared in the recent or more distant past, but, they've all left their kind of imprint on the landscape and indeed on the people that were living alongside them at the time. So some of these species were consciously exterminated. Black grouse and pine martins were hunted because they were considered pests. Wolves were killed because of the risk they caused to livestock and, I suppose, occasionally to people, perhaps. Some went much more recently. So black grouse, which still kind of hang on over in the Pennines, they disappeared around the 1980s. And the sort of the Haweswater, Kentmere area, that eastern bit, which is sort of probably the closest to the Pennines across the Eden Valley there, that was the last place that they clung on. And they disappeared really as a result of just changes to the habitat. So black grouse needs a mosaic, a healthy mosaic of woodland and scrub and grassland and heathland and bog. And if that whole habitat mosaic isn't there, if it starts to fall apart, then the black grouse can't get what they need from the landscape. And that was the reason that they disappeared. And there's signs in the land itself that's still there that show what's been lost. So we're all very familiar with bracken. Bracken is really showing the ghosts of previous woodlands. So bracken only grows in places where the soils are deep and dry enough for trees to grow. In the sort of primitive, ancient, pre-human Lake District landscape, bracken only grew in the woodland clearings. It's a species that demands lots and lots of light. So as you fell the trees, as the trees were felled by Neolithic people, those woodland glades, they grew, they got bigger, and the bracken was able to spread. Eventually, those areas were almost completely cleared, and the bracken spread more and more and more. And it was kept in check until relatively recently by people cutting it for bedding or for thatching or for packaging. The presence of larger animals in the landscape until quite recently. So cattle were a much bigger feature of farming until relatively recently. There were pigs, there were ponies. All of those animals are big enough to kind of break up the rhizomes of bracken. But as farming has become increasingly dominated by sheep, which are much smaller, and they just don't have that same ability to kind of break up the bracken, it's been allowed to spread still further. And so really it shows us, it shows us where that historical extent of woodland probably used to be, which I think is quite an interesting way to kind of reimagine that ancient landscape. You also see ditches in wet ground that's showing where sort of blanket bogs have been drained. You find rows of gnarled old hawthorns that showed where hedges used to be. So there's all these kind of ghosts in the landscape of the habitats that used to be much more dominant. You see ghosts of rivers running through floodplains sometimes, and those are paleo channels showing where the rivers used to run. And so all of these clues can be used to guide restoration, if that's what you want to do. So this is a small tarn. I mean, maybe tarn is a slightly grandiose word for it, but it's a small water body up on Naddle Common. And when we started out at Haweswater, we did lots of looking at maps and looking what opportunities for restoration there were. And when we look back at the old maps, the first Ordnance Survey map showed a small water body marked on the map. So that was from about 1870 or something like that. And it was there in the next version of the Ordnance Survey map and the one after that. But then when it got to the 1950 edition, all of a sudden that water body wasn't there anymore. And what had almost certainly happened was that grants that were being paid out at around that time to improve land for agriculture during that kind of post-war drive for productivity, a big drain was cut at the end of the tarn, and the water was just let away just to try to win that little bit more ground for grazing. And so this was a useful hint for some restoration work that we could do. Working with Cumbria Wildlife Trust a few years ago, the drain was blocked up, and hey presto, the wetland reappeared. And it's quite regularly used by reed buntings, and teal sometimes breed in it. And there's a huge range of sort of aquatic emergent plants, bog bean and things like that that have colonised it. Dragonflies breeding in it quite happily. So a nice kind of simple bit of restoration that hasn't had any impact on the sort of the farming operation that we're carrying out at Haweswater anyway. And of course, not everything was lost. So, you know, the Lake District has got some really important remnants of temperate rainforest, of ancient woodland, like the area that we've got at Naddle Forest. So this left-hand side is part of our enclosed farmland. A big focus of what we're trying to do at Haweswater is allow some of those fragments of habitat to spread back out into the wider landscape again. And it's quite interesting to compare the two sides of the reservoir there, I think. So the left-hand side at Naddle Farm was lucky in that it was preserved as a medieval hunting forest, so it maintained a higher proportion of woodland cover, whereas the other side was common and was grazed, and the trees, not having been able to regenerate over hundreds of years, resulted in it being a much more open landscape. But the underlying geology, all of that is exactly the same. So the potential for change is kind of demonstrated, I think, by that picture. So we had some really important patches of juniper scrub. Juniper's a big focal species for us. We grow thousands of juniper plants in our tree nursery every year. It provides the food for ring ouzels to feed up on before they migrate off to their wintering grounds in the Atlas Mountains and southern Europe and North Africa. But most of the juniper that we had was in these small, isolated and aged fragments. And perhaps the most interesting, or certainly my favourite of the kind of habitat fragments, and the most surprising perhaps to some people, are found on some of the cliffs and crags. So this is a photo of Heart of Fell, up beyond the reach of where the grazing animals can get. Some of the crags, which have got these sort of lime-rich intrusions, have just the most spectacular diversity and abundance of wild flowers, growing in you know, really just like a sort of vertical rock garden, if you like. So in this picture, there's angelica and roseroot and harebell, there's great wood rush, there's goldenrod and heather and bilberry, there's ness and meadow rue, and everywhere you go in these crags, it's just this really quite spectacular display. But sadly, these are all kind of out of sight and out of mind to most of the casual visitors to the Lake District. It's not an easy place to get up into. So I'd just like to read a little section from the introduction of the book, which is set in one of these little wildflower oases. 3 straggly trees huddle on the fissured base of Heart of Fell, high in the Lake District's eastern corner. From 30 feet below, I can tell that they're willows, but I need to get closer to work out which species. With plenty of well-rooted birch and rowan to cling to, scrambling up the first part of the flower-hung crag is easy enough. The upper section, a few more degrees to the vertical, is a different matter. A loss of footing now would result in a slide, a plummet, and a limb-breaking landing on the boulder scree below. Few people set foot up here, leaving botanical treasures undiscovered in steep gullies and on brittle ledges. Water running over the crumbly, calcium-rich rocks forms patches of fertile, rudimentary soil, great for flowers, not so great for climbing. Halfway up this slippery mess of a cliff, a solid-looking foot-long triangle of rock comes off in my hand, shattering on the ground below. I retreat with my pulse racing. Working around the base of the crag, I find a gentler ascent via a narrowing, grassy corridor hemmed in by rising cliffs. As usual, my progress is slow, distracted every few steps by the summer wildflowers. Stone bramble, alpine lady's mantle, northern bedstraw, lesser meadow rue and starry saxifrage enliven the rocks, the poetry in their names adding to the allure of their shapes and colours. The willows come back into view with just a narrow sloping slab bridging the gap between us, which I inch across crab fashion. I feel as if I'm reaching hallowed ground. Growing beneath the unruly mesh of the willow's branches are the fleshy stems of roseroot, the smooth oval leaves of devil's bit scabious, sturdy heather and vivid bilberry, a fragrant feast for any herbivore. That these plants are still here tells me that none have been brave or hungry enough to make the crossing. The soil is light and fluffy, with the rich mossy smell of an ancient oak wood. Any boot marks I leave will be quickly colonised, the plants erasing the evidence of my visit. Their glossy green foliage tells me that these are tea-leaved willow, a species which grows in only a handful of places in the Lake District fells. No more than shoulder height, their squat and sprawling form keeps them stable on their wind-battered refuge. The promise of such rare and beautiful plants makes botanising in these crags intensely addictive. There's always one more ledge to investigate, one more unexplored gully with secrets to uncover. I've never made it back to the car anything less than hopelessly late. And so, like some of the habitats and some of the species, the farming traditions, I would say, are clinging on to. And potentially they're in a similarly fragile state. The post-war incentives that I've mentioned that were used to intensify farming really distorted it, really changed it from the way that it was practiced previously. And it drove an intensity of management in a place that was really not well suited to it at all. And you could say that farming today is a shadow of the way that it was until a century ago. You know, there were not that long ago, a couple of generations ago, the farms were often much smaller and they were a patchwork of they were much more like small holdings, many of them. You know, there were cattle and goats and pigs and sheep and geese. They grew root crops. There were often orchards with apples and damsons. And, you know, they had to be providing as broad a range of things as possible because there wasn't the option to simply go and bring things in. They had to be much more self-sufficient than they are now. And those incentives from government, they really converted them into these sort of gigantic kind of commodity producers. You know, they were producing a much smaller range of things, and they still are. All of the modern aids that came along at the same time, the big, increasingly powerful tractors, the fertilizer, the steel frame portal buildings, concentrated feedstuffs, all of those combined allowed the sort of natural carrying capacity of the land just to be smashed through, basically. You know, bringing in all of these extra nutrients is that the land has just really suffered as a result of that. And as a result, many of these species that I've talked about already, you know, disappeared from the landscapes and the habitats were transformed. Hay meadows, many of them were converted to silage fields. Hedges were grubbed out and a huge amount of drainage was installed. And many of the kind of wet and weedy parts of the landscape where the wildlife was thriving, they were just tidied away and improved for farming. And so thanks to the opportunity that we've been given by working in partnership with United Utilities at Haweswater, the RSPB who I work for, we've been given a chance to turn things around on a what feels like a big piece of land when we're standing in the middle of it, but on what is in fact quite a small proportion of the Lake District National Park. You know, the land we're looking after covers about 1% of the Lake District. But we've got a different focus to many other farmers and land managers. You know, we're working on this catchment where a quarter of northwest England get their drinking water from. You know, 2 million people get their drinking water from Haweswater every day. And obviously we're a conservation organisation, so our priorities are somewhat different to some of our neighbours. And so the land that we've got, 3,000 hectares or so, comprises 2 farms, Naddle and Swindale, and a big chunk of common land. And we're working with as many people as we can, as many people that are interested in working with us to you know, recover as many of those habitats and the species that depend on them. And so we're a decade into that work. We took on the tenancies in 2011 and 2012. And it feels in that time that there has been a huge amount of change. You know, we've left the European Union, the farming subsidies are changing, the climate catastrophe is intensifying. I mean, I think it's pretty plain to see now that things are changing, that the climate is different, and we need to try to engage with that. We need to adapt to it, but we also need to do as much as we possibly can to try to mitigate it before it gets too late. And so it feels that the work we're doing is becoming increasingly important. And a big focus of what we're trying to do is to contribute to the discussion, contribute to the knowledge base about different options that are available for land. And, you know, the book is part of me trying to do that, but we also spend a lot of time talking to people, hosting visits, and we've just recently commissioned this series of visualizations that try to communicate what the landscape might look like over time. So this is the picture that shows the landscape that we started with. You know, is that kind of classic rugged Lake District landscape. You know, it's a cherished place. Haweswater absolutely is. It's beautiful. It's a place to come and kind of relax and unwind. But it's got a whole range of ecological issues. So, you know, the upper ground has been sort of heavily grazed by sheep and by wild deer, and been reduced to quite species-poor acid grassland. There's big tracts of bracken. The river in Swindale, you can see, is running incredibly straight because it had been sort of canalised a couple of hundred years earlier. We still had our one golden eagle when we started, but he was all by himself. And up on the hill, skylarks and meadow pipits were the most common species, and you didn't generally see a great deal else really up on the tops. The farming operation we inherited was pretty conventional. You know, silage was made, black plastic bales were wrapped. You know, we inherited a farm with about 1,600 sheep on it, and a whole range of things that you know, we could get stuck into trying to sort out. And change obviously happens slowly in the uplands, but this is what we hope the landscape might look like by something like 2050. So crucially, I think it's still beautiful and it's still rugged and it's still recognisable as a Lake District landscape. But the work that we're in the process of doing, the work that we're in 10 years into, is resulting in there being kind of more structure in the vegetation, more flowers and more colour, more invertebrates that are feeding on those flowers. And some of the changes that are depicted in here are already well underway. So you can see up in the left, the Swindale Beck has had its meanders put back and it's been reconnected into its floodplain. We're busily putting new hedges in order to kind of carve fields back up into something that you know, is a bit more recognisable perhaps to somebody who was farming up here a couple of hundred years ago, smaller patchwork of fields. Lots of in-field trees as well dotted around the landscape to provide not only a means of locking up carbon from the atmosphere, but also a place to give livestock shade and shelter. Wildlife is starting to respond already, so snipe have come back to the places where we've blocked up moorland drains and where we've created wetland habitat up on the hill. And the vegetation is starting to change in response to us moving away from a kind of a sheep-dominated grazing system to one that is more mixed and incorporates hardy cattle at a much lower density. We're seeing heather and bilberry come back in those places that were previously much grassier. And the bracken, our focus for the bracken is planting trees. You know, it's showing us where the woodland used to be. By planting trees into it, eventually the trees will shade that bracken out and it will allow the woodland to expand. So these kind of changes are, you know, these kind of big picture vistas are really, really helpful, but it's quite useful to look in more detail as well. So up in the sort of the wettest high ground, we've got lots and lots of blanket bog and valley mires of Haweswater. We're slowly getting around to bringing the water table back as close to the surface as we can get it by blocking those artificial drains that were cut in during the 50s and 60s. And this, I think, is a very accurate representation of what happens when you've got a drained peat bog that's grazed by sheep. Generally, it's dominated by quite coarse grasses and the water table is well down. The peat is exposed, and the peat is made of partially decomposed mosses and other plants. It's very, very high in carbon, and when it's exposed to the air, it reacts, that carbon in the peat soil reacts with the oxygen and carbon dioxide is released. If you bring the water table back up to the surface, then it creates those anoxic conditions, those conditions where the peat the vegetation continues to be locked down and it becomes a sink for carbon and it's locking carbon up again rather than releasing it. And by changing the grazing and taking sheep out you know, the vegetation responds and you get bog asphodel and sundews and butterwort and cotton grass and a whole range of species that are then going to be providing more food for the invertebrates and on up the food chain. So we've done a huge amount of that work already. About 1,000 hectares of bog have been restored at Haweswater over the course of the last decade. In Swindale, the meanders have gone back into the beck again. You know, physically quite straightforward work. The river was straightened a couple of 100 years ago because the people that were living there relied on getting that water away from their valley as quickly as possible. They weren't thinking about what that water did to the people downstream if it increased the flood risk. They were thinking about protecting their hay meadows, because if they lost their crop during the summer, they'd be screwed. You know, they needed that hay crop to feed their livestock through the winter months. We're still thinking about providing for the needs of people by doing this new work. You know, those people in the valley, they were delivering for the needs of their local society in order to survive. We're still thinking about the needs of society, but we're thinking about the needs of society for the people living downstream. We're thinking about those who rely on a cheaper, more sustainable, cleaner source of drinking water. And by having the meanders back in, sediment is allowed to drop out. And yes, it increases the risk of flooding of our hay meadows, but actually it hasn't happened since we did it 5 years ago during the summer months. But we live in a time now where actually we can be compensated through stewardship schemes if we do lose that hay crop. We've changed the way that the hay meadows are managing them less intensively with a later cut and an earlier shut up, and that's resulting in a real explosion of wildflowers moving back in. So melancholy thistle, wood cranesbill, lots of big sort of chunky herb species that were found in the hay meadows traditionally are starting to spread back out again. And crucially, we still use the hay. You know, we still have a flock of sheep. We haven't cut yet because we can't cut until the end of July and the weather hasn't come good yet. So fingers crossed next week. You know, we made 2,000 small bales of hay from there last year, and that went to feed the cattle and the sheep through the winter months. So crucially, we're keeping that farming system alive, as well as maintaining all the wildlife that relies on it. And likewise, changing the grazing has had a big impact on some of those flowers that were living on the cliffs and crags that I showed you the photo of earlier on. By moving away from having lots of sheep grazing right up to the base of the crags to having cattle grazing much more extensively, those wildflowers are tumbling off the cliffs. We've created some exclosures where that's happening particularly quickly. In other areas, it's going to take a bit of a longer time because obviously there's still deer in the landscape as well as the grazing cattle and a few sheep. So none of this stuff that we're doing is a shot in the dark. In the second part of the book, I spend time travelling to other places to see what other people have achieved. So places in Scotland and in North Wales, in the Alps and in Norway, you know, they've had a very different land management history in certain places. And so we can go and we can learn what options there are for nature and what the responses will be. So we can have a reasonable level of confidence of what's going to change over time. And we need all the help that we can get, really. Nature needs all the help that it can get. I think there's a fairly realistic prospect of pine martins cropping up more regularly in the Lake District. They're already starting to move in from Scotland. And there's a growing body of research that shows where you have pine martins, red squirrels tend to do much better. Pine martins preferentially predate grey squirrels because grey squirrels feed on the ground. They're much larger. Red squirrels and pine martins have evolved alongside each other. So red squirrels have strategies to escape from pine martins, which grey squirrels don't. An increasing number of studies are showing that where the pine martins re-establish, the grey squirrels just disappear and the red squirrels then get a break. So there's probably still going to need to be management, you know, the great work that goes on to protect red squirrels in this part of the world. But, you know, if a formerly present native species can kind of help us in that, then that seems like a good thing to encourage, really. I think beavers are likely to become a part of the landscape again at some point too. So there's a couple of enclosed projects in Cumbria already. The government is currently consulting on a beaver strategy. And I think in a place which has a huge amount of open water, a huge amount of wetlands, beavers will be very, very much at home. And yes, of course, they can cause negative impacts in places where farmland is very low lying and very wet and maintained by artificial drainage. But experiences from all across Europe, huge swathes of North America, where beavers had been exterminated and have returned, people now know how to deal with those impacts and move them around or control them or put in structures that help us to coexist with them. And the benefits of beavers and the wetland creation and the flood risk reduction they would bring would be absolutely huge. So although much of what I've been talking about has been about nature and the natural world, people are absolutely, central to what we're doing at Haweswater, both as beneficiaries, but also as actors, people doing all the different things that will result in that landscape change. So when we started out at Haweswater, there were just about 3 full-time staff. We're just up to 12 now. We will be when we recruit the new person in a couple of weeks' time. And so those people are doing a whole range of different things. So they're doing the traditional things. They're looking after the cattle and the sheep and the ponies. They're keeping the dry stone walls up. They're planting and laying hedges. But there's lots of new things too. So we've just established a new expanded tree nursery. We do education and science and research. We have sort of small ecotourism ventures that are going on as well. So this is a good news story for the local community. We spend a lot of money in local suppliers and contractors and all that kind of thing. So, I'm very conscious that change in the way that I've described is not universally popular. And I'm conscious that people worry about the fact that that change might mean rural depopulation and the schools closing down, and the pubs shutting and all that kind of thing. I think ours is one of a growing number of examples that says that doesn't need to be the case. We know we don't fit the mold. We know we're different to the people that were farming the land before. But then farming is always moving with the times. It's always evolving and adapting. And I think that the broadest range of people that are involved with looking after the land, can only be a good thing, really. Hopefully, at least some of you agree with that. But it's not. It's not universally popular. Not everyone was thrilled. And the first few years of my job at Haweswater was characterized by conflict. It was made very clear to us that not everybody was happy that we were there doing what we were doing. And I guess it's predictable that some farmers might well be concerned, particularly when we've got common land and, by us changing our grazing, that might have a knock-on impact on neighbouring farmers. But the opposition came from other sort of more surprising quarters as well. And I'd just like to read another little section from the book which describes some of that. So the Lake District, with its constantly evolving farms and an ecosystem full of holes, became a World Heritage Site in 2017. The nomination document that describes the English Lake District World Heritage Site runs to 716 pages. So it's difficult to summarise what the designation really stands for. It talks a lot about beauty, about farming and sheep, especially Herdwick sheep, the Lake District's native breed, beloved of Beatrix Potter. It mentions nature now and again and talks about the Lake District as the birthplace of the conservation movement, though it means landscape conservation, which focuses on preserving the aesthetics of a place rather than nature conservation, which is more concerned with the protection of species and habitats. It celebrates the area's geology and pretty lakeshore villas, its poets and farmers. If you look hard enough, you can find sections that support or oppose almost every possible point of view, but the emphasis on sheep farming is clear. The word sheep appears 365 times, the word flower only 3 times. Farm appears 1,052 times, nature 92 times. I'm sure there are lots of people who care passionately about the designation, but I've not met many of them. Most of the farmers I know are ambivalent. Contrary to what you might expect, World Heritage status doesn't provide them with either funds or protection. The Federation of Cumbria Commoners initially welcomed the designation, having described it as a powerful weapon that puts hill farming centre stage. But it's not clear how that weapon is to be used. A couple of years after the inscription, a delegation from the Lake District World Heritage Site Steering Group came to Naddle Farm to give my RSPB colleagues in me a training session designed to help us understand what being in a World Heritage Site meant for our conservation work at Haweswater and elsewhere in the lakes. They talked us through the cultural concepts from the nomination document and the new paperwork we now had to complete to enable the steering group to ensure our activities didn't impact on the World Heritage Site's attributes. In the discussion afterwards, I asked how the RSPB's presence at Haweswater was perceived from a World Heritage perspective. I was told that when the application was being prepared for UNESCO, the steering group had been forced to accept that there were a number of warts on the face of the potential World Heritage Site. One of these warts was the RSPB's presence at Haweswater. For my colleagues' work to have been described like this was extraordinarily offensive, and the fact that anybody would be prepared to say something so blunt to our faces took my breath away. I asked for clarification just to make sure I'd heard correctly. It was explained to us that we weren't authentic. Because we didn't fit the stereotypical profile of family farmers, we were considered second-class citizens. They were effectively saying that the only true stewards of the land in this newly minted World Heritage Site were the Lake District's farmers, ideally born and bred here and from farming families, lineages to which my colleagues and I didn't belong. Yet they also worried about the lack of new entrants to farming. It's hard to see how this sort of thinking can end well. So, I don't know about you, but I often find in the moment after an argument or a disagreement, I find myself wishing I might have said something different or responded in a different way or punched somebody. So I started kind of working up responses to what I might say should I be sort of challenged in the same way again in the future. And so and those initial kind of bits of writing were quite sort of shouty and cathartic and not the kind of thing that I really would have wanted anybody else to read. But I sort of continued to work at it and realised that Haweswater, with its story of a drowned village and the eagles that came and weren't there anymore, and the work that we're doing, there were all these interesting kind of interrelated stories, and sort of started to think, maybe there might be a book in this. And through a chance encounter with somebody who sort of decided to act as my agent, that was the kind of the genesis for the book. And I never had any ambition to be a writer, and it's all still a bit of a surprise to me that it's happened. So yeah, apologies if I'm a bit like rabbit in the headlights. So yeah, alongside the kind of the ecology of Haweswater is this personal story of what it takes to kind of do this kind of work in a place which is quite contested, where coming in and doing things differently is really, really challenging. And I've written it, for a lot of the people who I know work in similar jobs to me in the Lake District or in other parts of the world who bear a lot of those similar scars. We are doing what we feel is right, and we're trying to do it in a way which we hope is kind of reasonable and brings people along with us as best we possibly can. But we are as connected to these places that we're looking after and caring for as anybody else is. So Wildfell really is a story of work in progress, but my hope is that if we do our jobs properly at Haweswater, one day we'll have a landscape that's fit for eagles again. Thank you very much for listening. Happy to answer any questions.
Lee, can I ask that you repeat the question back, because the mic doesn't always pick up the question. Thank you.
So when you ask a question, could you say it very loudly and clearly so the mic can pick it up, so people on in Australia and Canada online can hear what you're saying?
Hello. Hello, I'm Lily Robinson.
Hello.
Hello, Lee. How do you utilise the ponies on your farm?
I knew you were going to ask that. Yes, yeah, we use fell ponies at the moment just for some fairly targeted conservation grazing. Sorry, the question was, have we used fell ponies? Yeah, so we don't have our own fell ponies at the moment, but we are looking into hopefully getting some, and we use them for targeted conservation grazing in a bit of one of our hay meadows, which is too coarse for the sheep to tackle, and they've been transformational actually. So in an area that was just very dense, sort of Molinia, purple moorgrass and rushes, late winter, sort of late autumn, early winter grazing has just sort of completely transformed it into really flower-rich, sort of damp pasture, particularly rich with devil's bit scabious and heath-spotted orchids. Devil's bit scabious, as you probably know, is the food plant of the marsh fritillary butterfly. And so we're looking at the possibility of a translocation of marsh fritillaries to take advantage of all that devil's bit scabious that's emerged, partly thanks to the grazing with the ponies. So we are looking at whether we can get some back up on the hill again on Mardale Common, sort of grazing with some of the cattle. It's quite important at the moment that we keep a low grazing level to allow some of the trees and scrub species and things to re-establish themselves. But over time, as the vegetation becomes more resilient and better structured, then the numbers of grazing animals can potentially increase again. But yeah, fell ponies are very much part of the mix, and we're keen to work with them more. Is that the right answer?
I could go on, but no, I'll stop there. No, very nice, very nice.
Question in the back, please.
Yes, Colin Davis. I was probably very fortunate to be born within sight of the dam at Haweswater. My father was the former forester for what was then the Manchester Corporation.
Okay.
And it's great to hear what you've got to say. And from my birthplace point of view, I want to thank you for how you're looking after it. But secondly, I've heard probably more recently about and I think the answer is no, but what's the feeling on reintroducing eagles, sort of almost capturing them and reintroducing them from Scotland?
Thanks. So the question was about whether we're thinking of reintroducing golden eagles. So that's nearly always the first question I get asked, so that's good. I'm glad you've done that. So we're not thinking about doing it. I'm hoping that we won't need to. So a few years ago, they started a golden eagle translocation project into southern Scotland. So the golden eagle population has been sort of centred on the Highlands, above the central belt of Scotland. There's about 500 pairs. There was a small population of about 3 pairs in the borders, but it seemed sort of stuck. It was just static. It wasn't increasing. And so for the last sort of 5 years, they've been taking birds from the Highlands. So golden eagles typically they lay 2 eggs, but they lay them asynchronously. So one hatches well before the other one. And what usually happens is that first chick either boots out the other egg, or it kills the other chick, or it's big enough that it can get a greater proportion of the food than the younger, weaker chick. And so nearly always it's just one chick that fledges. And so if you take one of those eggs away, you're not really impacting on the productivity and the population of the donor area. So they've been doing that for several years, and they've got a population now of about 33 birds circulating in the Scottish borders. And golden eagles, for their first kind of 3 or 4 years, they just roam around. So they don't establish a territory until they're kind of just about ready for sort of breeding. And so that population, if it becomes established, that is no distance to the Lake District. So they will colonise the Lake District if the habitat is right. And it's quite difficult for us to judge whether the habitat is right, and it'd be much better for the eagles to decide that for themselves, really. And excitingly, a couple of months ago, 2 of those southern Scottish birds came to pay us a visit at Haweswater. So they're nearly all sat tagged. And the really exciting thing for us was that these were the first 2 that made a foray into the Lake District since this project got started. And they came directly to Haweswater. They flew around for a day, and then they went back to Scotland again. So they didn't look at anywhere else in the Lake District. And actually, there's sort of evidence to back that kind of behaviour up. So before they started that Scottish project, they carried out this study that looked at the sort of historical nest sites, through place names and through documentary evidence and what have you. And they found that there was a long history of birds using traditional sites, abandoning them for ages, and then coming back to those same sites again. So just like that pair came back to Riggindale, which has a crag called Eagle Crag that's been there for ages and ages and ages, those 2 birds that came to pay us a visit, probably it was kind of hardwired into them, and they kind of knew there's a potential territory in that direction, or they could just see it from a very, very long way away, and it looked suitable, and they came to give it a look, and then they flew back north again. So that was pretty exciting for us, and maybe those were birds that were thinking, yeah, I'll give it another year and then bring a nice lady eagle back with me. But we've also had 2 white-tailed eagles that have done the same thing. So towards the end of last year, 2 white-tailed eagles from the Isle of Wight, where there's been a reintroduction project, which are also satellite tagged, and also are ranging around the country thinking of potential future nest sites. They came up, they also paid Haweswater a visit, and we saw their flight paths because they were plotted by these satellite tags, and both of them had these very noticeable kinks where they diverted into Haweswater, flew around a little bit, and then kind of went back on their way again. So in Riggindale, there is Eagle Crag, and next door to it is Heron Crag, which is a white-tailed eagle breeding site. So, you know, both eagles are breeding there historically. That behavior from both species makes us think that, you know, maybe they will one day again. But our focus really at Haweswater is on getting the habitat right. And for eagles, they will, if we get it right, there is every chance that they will colonise by themselves. So that's a long-winded way of saying no, we're not going to reintroduce them.
Thank you.
Yep.
We have a question from the Zoom.
Okay.
It would be good to hear Lee's views on climate change. Do we need to reduce stock for mitigation, and how much? And how will climate change affect nature and biodiversity?
Reduce stock, did you say?
Do we need to reduce stock for mitigation?
Right. Yeah.
And how much?
Yeah, I mean, climate change is the biggest challenge facing our species, I think. You know, I mean, I think the heat waves that we've been having, the change in the weather patterns, it's, you know, it's there for everybody to see now. And if we don't deal with it, then, you know, I'm pretty scared about the world our children are going to inherit. So reducing livestock, I think, is part of many different things that we have to do. If we can do it in an intelligent way, if we can manage grazing so that it builds the carbon in soil, they can be part of that as well. But I think that we need to change almost every aspect of our lives, and farming isn't exempt from that at all, I don't think. You know, a lot of places where people say, well, you know, sheep are the only thing you can grow. It's like, well, we could grow trees and we could grow carbon, and actually those things are products from the landscape, just like livestock is. So we need to start thinking about that kind of broader basket of public goods alongside livestock. And I would love for farmers to be thinking, you know, feeling proud of producing that stuff, as proud as they feel of producing their livestock. And that's kind of how I see the produce coming from our landscape. You know, livestock comes from it, but it's a much smaller quantity than it was previously. But all of those other goods are being kind of increased as a result. So yeah, farming, I don't think there's any way that you could put a figure on it. You know, there's a lot of people that talk about the need to get rid of livestock farming altogether. I think that is overstating it probably. And I think there are ways that we can integrate livestock with nature. But we need to get on with it. We need to make those changes as soon as possible.
2 more questions? Yes, please, here first.
I've much enjoyed reading your book about finding how many of the tiny alpine type flowers have come back. Have you, among those, found a tiny Gentiana verna, a little spring gentian?
Not at Haweswater, we haven't. So I don't think we're quite limey enough. So it's it's around. I've seen it sort of on some of those Orton limestoney places around Shap and things, but no, not yet. Maybe we will one day. Interestingly, we have found a couple of kind of quite lime-loving species recently that in a place that you wouldn't think of finding them. So common twayblade and adder's tongue were discovered in Naddle Valley a couple of weeks ago that hadn't been found on site before. And I do wonder, when you allow the vegetation to develop, to get deeper roots down, whether the scope for kind of cycling nutrients creates the conditions for species that we tend to think of being sort of obligate lime-loving species. But the fact that those 2 species popped up there was quite surprising to a lot of people, I think, me included. So maybe one day. But
I didn't know it was even as close as Shap. That's great.
Yeah, on the cattle grid that goes off to Orton, on the motorway junction there's some that grow just there.
Yes, please.
Hi, my name's Gary. I'm a scholar here in Pembroke. First of all, I want to say how much also enjoyed reading the book, and if anyone here, I guess it's a small number, who haven't got hold of that book, you really must. It's a fascinating and entertaining read.
Thank you.
Maybe it's a hard question to answer, but in your time though, could you say what is the most, has there been a change or a reappearance of a particular species or flora or fauna that has for you been like a wow moment that you thought, wow, we're making a difference, this made you feel really optimistic and positive?
Yeah, thanks. Glad you enjoyed the book. The question was about whether there's a species that's come back that sort of made me particularly excited, and the one is the salmon coming back to the restored beck. So, you know, something as simple as making a river that was straight, wiggly again, resulted in salmon returning to spawn incredibly quickly. So just by allowing the water to move in a more complex way and therefore sort the gravel so that they weren't just all being washed off downstream, but were deposited into sort of complex gravel beds, salmon came back to spawn within 3 months of the machines leaving the site. So that as a kind of symbol of nature's potential to recover when it's given the opportunity, I think is just sort of unparalleled, really. You get very used to having to wait for results when you do anything to land, really, but you know, aquatic systems respond so much more rapidly. So I mean, that's the sort of probably the kind of the poster species for seeing something return. But you know, we're starting to see, so red grouse, we recorded red grouse chicks on Mardale Common for the first time this year. So we've been doing bird surveys up there since we started. And that is as a direct result of us changing the grazing, the vegetation moving from being grass dominated to having a lot more heather in it. The red grouse eat the heather, the red grouse are now back. The red grouse are the things that the eagles might eat. So, you know, it's building things up from that bottom of the food chain all the way up. Tree pipits are a little brown job that most people won't be all that familiar with probably, but they responded really, really quickly to tree planting. So they come back quite quickly when young woodland's established. So yeah, those signs of change are there, and every one of those is hugely exciting and hugely rewarding for me and the team that are working there.
Can I ask a question? I hugely enjoyed your book. It was really well written, but I felt the pain, the personal pain that you have been through. Obviously, you've had elements of bitterness in the way in which your vision, if you like, has conflicted in some way with the current vision. And of course, the Lake District has always been, I suppose, in the limelight. Because change is happening and change is always difficult to manage. And in this room, there are people who are in the process of going through that change process. And you have talked about Haweswater, you mentioned in the book farmers in Naddle, Haweswater in general, that are already doing pioneering stuff.
Yep.
And I don't know to what extent your experience at Haweswater, can't transpose, that's not the right word, but the lessons you're learning and the process of building consensus with the farming community and the conservation community. Because I've seen war. When I first came here, I saw what I thought was war. I attended a Royal Geographical Society conference at Reading about 10 years ago, and I saw the fight between the so-called conservationists and the so-called farmers. This is unbelievable.
Yep.
And I sense in your book, you know, that's why I think that everyone in the room should read the book, because you express it in a very, very, very clear way, that conflict which everyone is dealing with. And I just think that the experience you're going through are inevitable, really, when anything which involves sharp change involves people making behavioural difference. But here in Haweswater, you have people, farmers, who are actually very much at the cutting edge.
Definitely.
And I think that's very exciting for us in this community to see that those risks being taken in difficult times.
I think, I mean, it's starting to feel like a genuine movement now. You know, there are enough people innovating, making changes that I think it is becoming increasingly socially acceptable to do so. And I think the people that kind of go out on a limb and do this sort of first of all are always going to be people that get the most kind of pay, really. But you know, I think the great thing is as well is that there are lots of people doing it, but all those people are talking to each other. You know, there are some really important kind of players in this. People like Pete Beeson at the Woodland Trust, who is just kind of being really good at connecting with lots of different people and putting them together and making them feel, giving them a bit of safety in numbers, really. And it's exciting, you know, but there are, you know, clearly there are still people who are clinging on to what they've been doing and they don't want to change, and that's fair enough, because it is difficult, you know, and a lot of people who perhaps are later on in life just don't have the energy, you know, they've been ground down by a lifetime of incredibly hard work, which is, you know, what farming is first and foremost, and finding the kind of the mental headspace to suddenly start thinking in a different way is incredibly challenging. So I think you know, the more that we can kind of work together, and the more that all of this growing community of people can share what they're doing and how it's working for them, the better. And hopefully it will continue. I have no doubt that it will continue to grow.
Yes, please.
Yeah, I think very interesting, and you're doing great work on that. Can I just ask how you make it pay?
Yeah.
Presumably, United Utilities want their pound of flesh. So how do the economics work out?
So we pay United Utilities rent. So one of the key reasons for us to take the farms on at the outset was to kind of understand the system and the economics from the inside. And what we found out, and we basically carried on with more or less the system that we started with. And we found out very quickly, and we published sort of a set of accounts basically for the first 3 years that showed that the livestock operation by itself was enormously loss-making. So we're a big farm, so the figures are big. The subsidy payments that we get are big because the area is big. And so in the first 3 years, we were on average generating an income of about £55,000 of livestock income, and the associated costs were over £200,000. By the time you factor in the labour, which a lot of farmers don't do, because bear in mind, the farm is their life, and so they're not necessarily putting a kind of rate on their time. We obviously do because we're a little bit different. But even when you just looked at the feed and the vet and med and the haulage and all of that essential stuff, that almost wiped out the livestock income by itself. And that's not just because we were doing it wrong. Multiple studies have found exactly the same thing. But rearing sheep in marginal upland areas by itself does not make money. And the only thing that makes it viable is the investment from the public purse. And so that's what's made us profitable, the investment from the public purse, like every other farmer. And the funding that we get is the same funding that all farmers can get. So it's basic payment scheme and it's high level stewardship. And I think that will always be a part of how land management in these kinds of places operates. But up until now, the payment has really, a lot of it has been sort of payment for farming, just for carrying on doing things as they've been done for a long time. The shift now is paying farmers to deliver those public goods, which is obviously what we're already aiming to do anyway. So we're positioning ourselves, I think, quite well for where those funding streams are going to go. But they're not guaranteed. And now we're outside of Brexit, they're outside of Europe, I should say. They are more vulnerable. Change in government could mean a change in the way that money is spent. And we're very mindful of that. And so we try to think at Haweswater, although we're obviously part of the RSPB machine, we operate as a sort of closed financial entity as well. And we try to think like a business would do. And so we're diversifying. So we have started this tree nursery, which will be selling trees and wildflowers. We set up a sort of celebration woodland memorial trees initiative, which generates quite a surprisingly large amount of money, actually. We do ecotourism, so we have sort of wildlife viewing hides that people pay to hire. We've just got planning permission for a little bunkhouse that we're going to open. So it's all very small scale, low key stuff, because part of why Haweswater is special is because it's quiet. We don't want to spoil that at all. So we're not about driving loads of people. It's all about giving people that are already coming kind of richer experiences, if you like. And all of that suite of other income should plug the gap that is going to be left by the declining basic payment scheme. And then we're also crucially looking at the farming operation and making sure that we are not putting in unnecessary inputs. By farming in a traditional way within the carrying capacity of the landscape, without fertilizer, without supplementary feed, means that all of those input costs are absolutely slashed. And yes, that means reducing livestock numbers, but actually a really insightful report called the Less is More report that was published a few years ago basically said that is the only way you stand a chance of being profitable, is to farm based on the availability of what's freely available to you, like as in grass that's grown by the sun. So that is a kind of central principle to our farming operation, and it's never going to be profitable, but alongside all those other initiatives and attracting that government grant, that's what makes it pay. And that's the same boat that pretty much everybody else is in, really. But the mix is obviously going to be different for each different farmer in each different place. But I think, yeah, that blend of kind of innovation and enterprise, livestock farming and public goods is that's going to be the only game in town, I think.
Yeah.
One last question, thank you. Yeah, no, please.
I hear your enthusiasm about this, but if you didn't have the RSPB as a big brother behind you, would you do it on your own?
I wouldn't have had the capital to put it up in the first place. So if I had, then this is how I would be doing it, definitely. And I'd love to have a little farm, and I would be doing all the same things, but it would be a hell of a lot smaller than the 3,000 hectares we've got to play with. But I think it is the smart way of doing things. It's sort of spreading your bets, which is it's basic business sense, as I said, really.
Gordon, do you want to say a few words? No?
Thank you. Anyway, it's my pleasure. Just close that if we can. There we go. Sorry, Lee, you can stand up because otherwise we'll be off camera. So. Yeah, no, it's my pleasure and honour to thank Lee for the talk he's given this evening. We can sense that it hasn't been easy for Lee to come into this community and do things the way that himself, the RSPB, wanted to do things. I grew up as a farmer. I was more of a dairy farmer than a hill farmer, but growing up, nature never really had a voice in the farming operation, and it's gone on that way for quite a long time. And at last, it is starting to change. And no farmer really sets out to do down nature. It just kind of happens, quietly, slowly. It just slides, and because it slides so slowly, it's like a glacier. No one really knows it's moving, but then eventually you see that it is. And for Lee, obviously it's been quite a challenge, but he's not standing here saying, this is how you have to run your farm. This is how you should be doing things. What he's saying is, this is how I'm doing things. And if you want to do things in the way that I'm doing it, then I'm here to help. This is what we found. This is this is what we found. And there's 2 or 3 farms across Haweswater who are doing a similar thing. Galborough Farm, obviously we've all heard of James Reedmans as well. Vladimir Putin has perhaps done us all a favour by pushing up the price of fertiliser. So fertilisers are barely affordable now to farmers. And so, this knowledge that these other farms are acquiring becomes very important, because Lee, in many ways, has a cushion in terms of how much skin has he got in the game. But for every hill farmer, the worst thing that can happen is for them to lose their farm because it's not profitable. And it's a very dangerous step. It's a risky step for them to change the way that they farm. Very, very difficult indeed to say, right, I'm going to go all out and do it the way Lee's done it, or or some other way. And so it's very easy just to keep going the way we always have. But the winds of change are definitely behind nature, climate change, flood resilience, and all of the payments are going to, in the future, when the government finally does get its act together and get those payments and those subsidies out, the winds of change are behind that, and farmers will continue to farm and continue to be land managers, which they always have been. And I'd like to thank Lee. He's come here not to say you need to change and you need to do this and that. He's come here to say, this is the way I'm doing it. I've had a hard time doing it, and I've come in for a lot of criticism, but it is starting to work for us, and nature finally does have a voice. Whether we'll see sea eagles, well, hopefully we can look at Lake Haweswater and start to restock it in the way that it was 200 years ago, when they used to fish in that lake with nets. There were so many fish in it. So, it's a start for nature to get a voice, and it's down for the various, agricultural families and communities that are listening. If it's not for you, then we're not saying it's for you, but Lee's here if you want to see some of the methods he's used in terms of how he's done it, then he's here to help, as indeed are the other regenerative farmers in the valley. So, one last thing, we do like to rattle the tin at these events. Hopefully you've enjoyed the event, found it very informative, and I found it informative. You can donate online at, if you just go onto the FOUW website and People's Fundraising website, you can donate there, or there's a donations sheet on the table there. There's a range of books. Lee's, you're signing copies, Lee, I take it? I hope so. Yeah, there's Lee signing copies. We do ask the speaker always for basically 50% to the speaker's charity and 50% to us. So Lee, if you have a charity that you like. RSPB. I thought it might be. That's a side bet, that one. So that'll go in as well. So if we could show our appreciation in the usual way, and one last thank you to Lee.